Well, again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're coming in from. I'm just thrilled that we're going to be spending this next about 45 minutes or so together. And one of the key questions that I've been working on with my team and in partnership with many schools and systems around the world for about 7 years or so has been this question about how we can re-energize and reactivate collective professional learning. I got to be honest, I've got nothing to sell you, nothing to pitch you. Everything I'm going to share today is already free online, or if you want, you can pick up a $20 book to unpack most of the core ideas. But what I'm hoping together, and particularly if you can bring up the website and have that available, that together in this session, we can give you confidence to either, if you've engaged with teaching sprints before, reactivate that knowledge. Perhaps you've fallen off and you had a little bit of a look at the work. Maybe you even did a sprint and it's kind of just withered away. We're going to help you re-energize and rethink about what it would look like to use this process in your work. For others, you're new to the concept of teaching sprints. You want to come and understand what is this all about and check out whether or not it might have some relevance for you. Well, back in about 2015, I was working in partnership with some friends at the Alberta Teachers Association. And we were driving a network learning community all around the question of how we could re-energize and reactivate collaborative teacher learning. And the core driving question to really push this project over this time has been simply this: how can overloaded educators keep getting better at their craft? Now, this was a question that was driving us back 7 or 8 years or so ago, but it couldn't be more relevant in 2023. Here we are with a sense of systemic exhaustion. We've all got a strong post-COVID hangover, and we're all in our context working through workforce challenges, teacher shortages, and generally a sense of exhaustion that means it's harder than ever before for ourselves, our teams, and our organizations to keep getting better at our craft. And of course, we know we've got to keep this work right front and center. Getting better at our craft of teaching is at the core of how we can unlock better outcomes and better learning experiences for our students. For those of us who are feeling stretched, then of course, getting more efficient and effective at our teaching is going to mean that we can save our own time and our own energy. And if we're going to stay in this game and enjoy this game over time, then each of us, I think, should have the joy of getting a little bit better at our craft each and every term that we're in our work. Indeed, well-structured professional learning must be part of any school's teacher wellbeing approach. Every educator should get the joy of making progress and having agency in one core area of their craft every term. But I think you will probably find, as I find in all of the partner schools that I work alongside, that it's more difficult than ever to prioritize time to not just do the job, but to get better at the job. Every study we hear, every personal conversation we have, people are saying the job has never been more intense. And so whether you're an educator, whether you're a team leader, whether you're a leader of a school or indeed a leader of a system, we all have to find ways to somehow navigate this tension. And it's a real tension. On one hand, we want to support, provide well-being support, and sort of just back away a little bit from our colleagues and our educators and say, we know you've got a huge amount to do. We know you're low on energy. We just want to create some space for you just to focus on the core. But at the same time, we have this aspiration to say, hey, you should get to keep getting better at your craft. And indeed, if our team and as our school and as our system's going to get better, at the core of that improvement has got to be improving in our daily classroom practice. I wonder whether you feel this tension. We've got colleagues coming in here from beautiful Winnipeg in the middle of Canada through to Hong Kong, all over Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. And I want to say, as someone who spends a lot of time both digitally and then most recently traveling and engaging with educators, there is a sense of relentless intensity. And so what typically happens, to be honest, is a little bit like what happens in my own family life. As many of you know, we've worked personally together. I've got 3 young kids. My wife's a primary school educator. And it's a Wednesday here it's a Thursday here in New South Wales. And one of the things that, I really aware of is this sense that if I got home tonight and at 8 o'clock, I said, we finally got the kids to sleep, everything's kind of in order. And I said to my wife, hey, let's sit down and get a few things organized for the family. And it'd be absolutely fine if we were working out who's going to take who to Saturday sport and what are the other commitments, if we were kind of doing the parenting family work. But what happens if I said at 8 o'clock when we're exhausted, it's the end of a Thursday, hey, I thought, let's not do the kind of parenting family organizational work. I was wondering whether we could have a conversation about how we could improve our work as parents. I don't know what you think, but I can tell you that conversation's not going to go down so well. And so in any time where you've got intensity, it gets increasingly difficult for anyone to say, hey, let's focus on getting better at the work. When for most people, they want to focus on getting the work done. So what are we going to do as we close out 2023 and as we open up opportunities in 2024, as educators, as team leaders, as leaders of schools, as leaders of systems? Well, I think all of us need to have an answer about how we're going to support overloaded educators to keep getting better. And teaching sprints is the collective answer that me, working alongside hundreds of educators and thoughtful friends and colleagues, have come up with as a potential way forward in multiple contexts. Well, teaching sprints starts with a real focus, and this has really been enhanced over the last couple of years of us running this work, particularly in and around the challenges of COVID. We'd say taking a teaching sprints approach to your team-based or school-wide professional learning is really going to be about focusing in on instructional habits. Instructional habits are absolutely the core target. If you have low levels of time, minimal bandwidth to get into this work, we absolutely need to find a way to focus on the things that matter most. And the things that matter most are not the special lessons. They're not what my friend Tom Sherrington from the UK calls speed camera behaviors. That is the way that we drive when we know that speed cameras are around, or the way that we teach when we know someone's coming around for a special learning walk or visit to our lesson. Now, what we want to focus on is not the special things we do sometimes, but the things that we do the majority of times. And if we can focus in on instructional habits, then we can unlock a huge amount of long-term improvement across the classrooms that we support. It's a little bit like thinking about cooking. The analogy we use in the teaching sprints community is we often ask people, hey, what is your default meal? Like if it's a Wednesday, no one in the household has worked out what's going to be cooked, and it's on you to make sure there's a meal. What's your default meal? I'd love it if you could just drop into the chat bar here and let me know, what's a default meal? A meal you can cook without any real effort, a meal you can cook without any reference to a recipe, a meal that you can cook, and at the same time, you're probably going to be thinking about work or family or other things you're dealing with. It's great to get the unbelievable diversity here around the world of different ways that people think about that default meal. And the default meal is a beautiful thing because it means that when we're engaged in that work, it's not cognitively or emotionally demanding. And in fact, we can do that whilst thinking about other things. Well, perhaps not just your default meal. I wonder what your kind of cooking repertoire is during the busyness of educational and school terms. For most of us, there's probably a handful of meals, maybe 5 to 8 meals that we're cooking the majority of times. Maybe that default meal is coming up almost every week or twice a week in the busiest times. And what do we do if someone's special? Well, if someone's coming for dinner, maybe we choose one of our 1 or 2 special meals. We often don't go to the cookbook and come up with something utterly new. But by the time we get into midlife and busy, what do? We have a couple of go-to special meals that we can cook if someone's coming around. Well, why am I talking about cooking? Well, I think the analogy here is that when you think about the work we're doing to improve our practice, when we figure out the work you're doing to support other people to improve their practice, the most useful target for that work is our default pedagogical meals and our core instructional repertoire. It's not about doing some special action research that means that we do something special for a few weeks or a few terms, and then finally we're relieved that it's over, because then we return to defaults. No, focusing in on our core pedagogical meals and our core instructional repertoire will mean focusing in on how we ask questions and how we check for understanding, how we use model worked examples, and how we model metacognitive talk. I'm talking about the kinds of instructional habits and ways of working that we use daily, multiple times, and that add up to serious change in the types of learning experiences that our learners get across the classrooms that our educators teach in. I want to say that as we come out of COVID and as we deal with deep levels of exhaustion and workload pressures, that putting a focus on learning and unlearning key instructional habits is going to be a really fruitful target for any professional learning that you're planning into the year ahead. So if upgrading our instructional habits, if you like, either taking a default meal we already regularly cook and making a little adjustment to make that better, or adding one new recipe or one new part of our repertoire every term is the goal, then how might we go about doing that in a way that will allow you as leaders to not feel like you're over pushing your staff, and that you're focused on change that's sustainable and that can add up over time? Well, as a teaching sprints community, we focus on three big ideas. And I should say from the outset, there's no pressure or expectation from me that you'll do teaching sprints or that you'll name it teaching sprints. I've got nothing to push on you at all. The teaching sprints approach can be used in any kind of professional learning that you're already running. As you think about the ideas that I'm sharing, and as you sprintify, or as you bring some of those ideas across and improve the work that you're already doing. So firstly, focus in on the instructional habits that matter most. Number two, apply these three key ideas to sustainable habit change. And the first one here is to make sure when we're talking about teacher learning and improvement, we're focusing on tiny shifts. But secondly, that the tiny shifts that we suggest are based on research. And thirdly, that we give people a chance to practice it. In your handout that Renee will also drop back into the chat bar if you haven't had a chance to get it, there's a little summary here that you can take away. Well, the first big idea here is tiny shifts. And this is unique really to the teaching sprints approach that we've co-developed in partnership with schools and leaders around the world. Too often in professional learning, people have had a tendency to do big change fast. Sort of this sense of we're going to transform practice. And this comes from a really positive area. And it really comes from the sense of, hey, we want to make big change quickly for our students. That means we want to really update and adjust what's going on in our classrooms. And we have big aspirations to do that. And so we ask for big change fast. But unfortunately, busy adults find big change fast almost impossible. Think about how difficult it is to change how you eat, how you move, to put yourself to bed on time. How much more difficult is it, therefore, to make adjustments to the instructional habits that get you through a busy day, a busy work, a busy week, or a busy term? And so the insight we had in teaching sprints was that we should work on small incremental changes to practice that could add up over time. This means that a teaching sprint that I might be running now in October on something like picking non-volunteers in my explicit teaching time isn't really just about doing that work for this October and then being grateful that it's over and I can move to something else. No, the idea is that I spend this October really working on a small, tiny shift to one part of my questioning technique. And once I've done that, I actually want to add that to my repertoire such that I'll not ever stop doing that across my teaching career, other than if there's a shift in the evidence or I come to believe that I need to upgrade that habit again. You see, the problem with so much of teacher improvement is that we've worked to try to do big change that's not sustainable, and we fall back to default ways of working. Instead, our view is you take a view of 2 to 3 years, and that every educator is getting better at one thing per term, which would be about 4 things per year, which would be about 12 things over 3 years. And that's enough to dramatically shift the learning environments in which they're teaching. You see, we've tried to do too much over a short period of time, and that's often resulted in unsustainable change and a return to defaults. So the first big idea for a teaching sprints approach is to go after tiny shifts that add up and that sustain over time. Well, the second big idea that we've co-developed in the teaching sprints approach is, well, if we acknowledge the natural limits of busy adults to only change probably 3 to 4 things across a year, then we'd want to make sure each one of those things are based on the best available research. Hey, there's unlimited ideas about what we could change or do in our classroom practice. And if you sit with any group of educators, people will have lots of ideas about what they think kind of works for them and how they do it. And of course, we want to encourage deep professional dialogue. But if we're starting to get to the natural practical limits of most people only changing 3 to 4 things in a year, then we should think seriously about what are the things that are going to have the best bet of improving the quality of instruction and learning. And for me, the best place to find those best bets is in the research evidence. And we are well served now in a way that when we first kicked off teaching sprints, we really were not. We've got a whole range of quality translated research materials that are both based on cognitive science, studies of effective teaching, and empirical experimental studies that test how things work in natural environments. And bit by bit, we are now in a position where we can make fairly strong claims about a set of strategies that have a high probability of supporting learning across a range of domain areas and across a range of contexts. So second big idea is research engagement. I wonder to what extent at the moment your professional learning has tiny shifts based on research. And the third is intentional practice. As we did a scan of the research literature about expertise development, one big thing stood out that seemed to be dramatically overlooked when we talked about teacher learning. And that is, we overlook the importance of intentional and deliberate practice. Unfortunately, most of the time when teachers come together for their learning, the students aren't there. We're having some type of professional learning session, which is great. We've got new knowledge input, we're having dialogue, we're talking about what we will do. But of course, the key way to get better at any human area of expertise is to practice wherever possible in context. And there's a whole literature about how we can engage in deliberate or intentional practice, picking one small thing beyond our comfort zone, working in an intensive way around improving that core part of the practice, and then wherever possible, seeking high quality feedback, if possible, from an expert in the field, or sometimes from a peer who's at least able to help you see the impact of what you're doing on those around you. Teaching sprints is really about saying that we need educators to have the opportunity to work on an instructional habit, to choose something much smaller than what they would typically ask of themselves to do, to ensure that that smaller thing is based on sound research, such that it's very likely that if they can get this working in their practice, it will pay off for their students. And lastly, that actually they have a chance to practice it in their classroom to build that into their instructional repertoire. Well, let me ask you here, as you think about this teaching sprints approach and the 3 big ideas that anyone here could apply to any professional learning that you're already running, which of these 3 ideas has the potential to have the most significant positive influence on the way in which you approach professional learning? Is it moving towards tiny shifts? Is it about basing it on deep research engagement? Or is it about heightening the fact that we don't just need more knowledge, but actually we need intentional practice? All right, would love it if you could drop down which one stands out for you. Thanks, Anne. Appreciate you kicking us off. Matthew says tiny shifts, Tony, intentional practice. Olivia on intentional practice as well. I must say, I use the term intentional practice because it's actually quite difficult in education to do the technical definition of deliberate practice. And so we use this sense of we're trying to actually engage in that way. Candace, intentional practice would, wherever possible, involve that high quality feedback. And in the literature on expertise development, Anders Ericsson, who's really the work in which this is, his work is really the basis of much of our modern understanding of expertise development and deliberate practice. They would typically say that high quality feedback from a mentor is crucial for that work. It's one of the reasons why we don't use the term deliberate practice, but we use intentional, because in many school contexts, you're not going to have those key mentors or instructional coaches available to all educators. And so we can still engage in thoughtful practice. We can still often get support from peers, and wherever possible, we absolutely need to move towards a situation where we can access those expert mentors and supports. All right. So you're sort of seeing the case. Number one, do you think it matters whether or not teachers get a chance to keep getting better? If not, hey, close off the webinar. It's not a problem for you. If you think, yeah, it matters, but it's really hard to do, not because they don't care, not because they don't want to get better, but because it's very, very difficult in the modern context of the crazy busyness of schools. So we say, one, why don't we just focus on instructional habits? That's likely to pay off better than anything else that we focus on, because it's the stuff that makes up the daily pedagogical life of our work. Number two, what we want to talk about here is actually really getting into supporting teachers get better at their instructional habits by applying the literature about effective professional learning. Work on tiny habits, make sure they're engaged with research, and thirdly, that they've got intentional practice. Now, we're going to get into some of the different types of research that you might want to draw on. But one of the great things about the teaching sprints approach, in my mind, is that it's open to an approach that is appropriate for your school and your system. We've got an idea about the sorts of things, and we give lots of examples of where you could go. But actually, I know many of your schools already have instructional models. Many of your systems already have evidence-informed guidance. And so teaching sprints can be the mobilizing process for you to take that which has been around for a while, but hasn't been implemented. All right. So how do you make this practical, Simon? I mean, yeah, it's fine to say work on instructional habits. It's fine to say, yep, these three big ideas, but how could we have a shared process? And that's where the three-step process for teaching sprints comes in. The best sort of feedback I get about teaching sprints is that people say something like, is that it? And I said, yeah, it took us 5 years to get it that simple. Simplicity is very, very hard fought. Through the hard work of many educators and colleagues, we have slowly got this down to something that's right of the essence of what matters. What we learned through studying professional learning processes used in many teams is that 7, 8, 9-step processes might be comprehensive, but half the staff get lost and don't know where they're even up to when they get to term 2. Instead, we want a sharp, focus, memorable process that everyone understands. Prepare, sprint, review, such that every educator across your team, school, or system would know where they're up to in the process, and that they can complete that process each and every term. The prepare phase, and you can download this diagram from the website. You've also probably got it in your handout that Renee will drop in again to the chat bar. The process is boiled down to the essence of what really matters in this work. Prepare, sprint, review. Prepare is about coming together with colleagues to determine that focus of practice improvement. This part of the work is all about the knowledge building. The sprint phase is about the intentional practice in context, and the review phase is about learning from that experience and finding ways to contextualize that new practice into your typical repertoire and finding a way to build fluency in that work so that it can continue over time. Each phase of the process applies the three big ideas and allows people to engage in a different type of adult learning. So the prepare phase is the phase where we're coming together to first and foremost build our knowledge. Whilst of course we want to base our ideas on the best available research evidence, the worst kind of first wave of research evidence mobilization in education came where educators received some sort of list given from on high about what worked better than others and were told without thinking about it to do one of those things. And so I remember doing lots of lesson observations where you'd walk in and you'd see someone put a learning intention on a board because they were told that this was somehow a powerful way to move learning. And then they would just kind of teach the rest of the lesson like they normally did, as though, hey, I did the thing you told me to do. Now I'm just going to kind of get on and do it. And for me, this has been the problem around giving educators a sense of you need to do this, but not actually building their adaptive expertise. Adaptive expertise is about respecting the deep understanding and experience of educators and letting them not just hear the answer about what research suggests will be actually effective, but build their own mental models and understanding so that they can make good decisions about how and when that strategy or technique might be effective in their context. So the prepare phase is an invitation to come together with colleagues. We often do this over about 60 to 90 minutes, but of course it's utterly flexible in and around the time restraints that you have. Colleagues come together to engage in some new learning informed by research evidence. They draw out connections and challenges to practice. And then here's the key, they determine a precise teaching strategy or technique. And this is the tiny shift. We don't want people to work on something like, I want to improve questioning. We want them to say, I'm really working on Dylan Williams' idea of hinge questions in mathematics. Precise, clear, a habit I could build and understand and add to my repertoire. So prepare is about deep discussion, dialogue, and then a decision about what it is we're really going to work on. And that itself unlocks unbelievable progress for people because they often realize in the PLC, the TLC, or whatever you call your team professional learning time, that they've often worked on something far too broad. As a community, we use the language of boulder, pebble, sand. And we use that as a respectful way of saying, hey, I think we're still at the boulder level here describing the practice. It's such a big area. Let's roll it around until we can get it right to that grain of sand. A highly specific strategy or technique within a specific domain area that we want to try out over the next 2 to 4 weeks. Then we move into the sprint phase. And this is the practicing phase. This is about saying over 2 to 4 weeks, we're going to engage in that intensive practice activity. Much of this practice will happen in our classroom. And this is where we encourage educators to make decisions about how they want to go about learning how to integrate this strategy into their context. As a former high school teacher, where you're teaching multiple lessons with different students across the day and week, I'll often say to high school and secondary colleagues, just pick one class. So for example, I might just pick my year 9 science class. And that's the area where I'm really working on, for example, low stakes quizzing as a key strategy or technique within the retrieval practice research that I've been looking into. And so when I look at my timetable, I'm not trying to practice this strategy all day, every day. I'm choosing one specific class. I'm limiting the effort and the push on my own workload and time by saying my practice time for this strategy is just in year 9 over the next 2 to 4 weeks. For other levels of schooling, it might be we're just doing this within our explicit time, teaching time on writing, or we're just doing this within our STEM unit. I don't mind when it is, but we want to limit the practice space so that people can feel as though that they're bringing intensity to just one key element that they're upgrading. This is a little bit like helping teachers to step out of autopilot, that sense of not just running their typical instructional repertoires and routines, but picking one thing to do differently. And so during the sprint phase, someone might come into your classroom, or you might go into a teacher's classroom doing this, and you'll think, well, they're just teaching. I know they're teaching, but there's at least one part of this work, where they are deliberately stepping out of autopilot, making adjustments in light of how it's working or not, and finding a way to see this through. During the sprint phase, we encourage teams to come together for a 15-minute check-in meeting. We've got a simple protocol online you can use, and it's a great way to do some peer support and accountability, where people ask, what have you done? Where are you stuck? And what will you do next? Well, the sprint process closes out with review. In the review, we're providing space and opportunity for people to talk about what they did, how it felt, their hunches around impact, and how they might then like to integrate this practice into their future teaching craft. It's about providing time for people to reflect on their experience and explore how they could learn from each other, and then find ways to move what they did during that 2 to 4 weeks into their long-term work. Remember, most of the benefit of the teaching sprint that any teacher runs during a term won't happen during that term. The point is that if I run a teaching sprint in October 2023, that hopefully if it's a evidence-informed strategy or technique that I found a way to integrate into my repertoire, I'll be still using what I learned during this teaching sprint in 2025 or 2026, because now I've integrated it as part of my repertoire. It's part of my default pedagogical cooking now. And each one of my students is going to get benefit from the highly specific learning and training that I do throughout any one sprint. So the prepare, sprint, review process provides a shared mental model and language for every educator to make sure they get an opportunity to improve at least one instructional habit each and every term. It's reasonable, it's clear, and most people say, hey, you know what? This is really, really useful, because finally I'm talking about my key instructional practices. Alexandra's asking a great question here about sustainability. And we know there's always a tendency for reversion to default ways of working. Now, that's not a problem for sprints. That's a problem for all adult behavior change and habit change. Alexandra, what we would normally suggest is that as each and every sprint is done, number one, by working on just one area every term, you're going to greatly increase the likelihood that people are engaging in a level of habit change during their sprint, that it will be sustained over time. Number two, as a team, they'll often review, hey, what's the sprint we've just done, and how are you going and sustaining previous strategies or techniques? Has they dropped off, or have you been able to sustain them over time? All right, well, where could you get started? Now, there's lots of different decisions here to make. But one of the things I just want to reinforce before we get down into some specific ways you might want to get started, or for others, reboot and re-engage, is just to not lose sight of the main goal. The main goal of teaching sprints over any cycle is that every educator is becoming more metacognitive about their own teaching and starting to deliberately change one instructional habit. And by going after something very small and very manageable, we often find that teams say we get all these other benefits, like we have this shared sense of psychological safety because we're now starting to talk about our practice and what's working and what's not working. Some say they get a real sense of, and surveys suggest they really enhance their individual and collective efficacy. They get this sense that even in all the relentless craziness, they're progressing work, they're moving things forward, and they feel as though each and every term, no matter what else has happened, that they can actually name one part of their craft that they've moved forward. Well, whether you're on your own or hopefully some with others, hey, can I just ask you to take a moment here? Can you reflect and share with a partner and then drop into the chat bar? What's one thing you like about the Teaching Sprints shared process for research-informed practice improvement? Is there something here that you think might add value and benefit to your work? Take a moment and drop something into the chat. So appreciate the many insights here coming through, and I'm sure my team will pull these together, we'll de-identify them, we might send them out when we send out the recording, the slides, and a whole bunch of resources to get into this work. Now, I love that many of you, whether in the chat bar or I'm sure thinking, are already getting into the operational side of these things. And I just have to be really clear about what I am offering and what I'm not offering. What I am offering is a simple, field-tested approach to how educators can keep getting better at their craft. What I'm not offering is a prescribed way that you must do this in your context. There is a whole range of different ways that you could make this process work for you. And the number one thing that will get in the way is if you think that I'm here to tell you exactly how you must use this process. Quite the opposite. What we believe is that once you understand the focus, the big ideas, and the three-step process, you should back yourself to explore how you would like to apply this process in your context, with the goal to build a regular routine of how educators get better at their craft in your context. So for some, people are going to already have a PLC or a TLC or an impact teams process. And you might say, like some people I was working with this week, they say it's kind of just, it's lost some energy, Simon. In fact, for some, it never really worked at all. And we're sort of just talking and we're looking at some data, but we're not really moving things forward. And if we think about the last 2 years and we ask people, what deliberate changes to your practice can you see that you've sustained from this work? People are saying, oh, I'm not sure. And they say, you know what, let's keep the name of our PLC or TLC or teacher teams, and let's just drop this process in quietly as a way to re-energize. We don't have to rename all the structures. Let's just drop this process in as a way of working. For others, they say, hey, actually, this is a really nice way to do one-on-one instructional coaching or one-on-two kind of triads. And it provides a really simple model to do that. When I'm coaching someone, we do a prepare meeting where we're knowledge building and thinking. Then we've got a 2 to 4 week period of intensity. That's where I'm going to do my demonstration lessons, modeled lessons, observations, co-teaching. And then we're going to review together. Oh, I really like this. For others, they say, hey, you know what? I'm working with multiple schools in different ways. And what I do is I use the sprint approach by saying I come and do some knowledge building and workshops. And then I help all the educators I'm working with to try to do the application step. And then I come back and help them do that review. And Tanya, I'm so pleased that you've seen some of this stuff work. The thing, what I want you to know is that you should back yourself in to make decisions about how this could work in your context. Because we need to re-energize collaborative teacher learning in a time where the profession is feeling exhausted, not really valued, and a feeling as though everything is happening at them and to them. And my view is part of our well-being response is to have a sensible, simple, reasonable way for everyone to feel like they're making progress. Well, how could you start? My number one advice here, team, is just start. A little bit like cooking pancakes. Don't worry about the first pancake. It never turns out all that well. And that's exactly the way it's meant to be. You don't have to think your way into this. You need to experiment your way into this. So whether it's you and a few others, you and a volunteer team, why don't you play around with some options in October and November? Don't try to get in this situation where you're going to make a definitive decision about rolling this out to everyone. And you're already worried about the pushback and the challenges around buy-in. For many of us, we just need to get in and get playing with this process. For others who kind of did it and it sort of dropped off again, a little bit like my exercise regime or certain good decisions I've made before about how I might eat or not eat, and I kind of somehow in midlife just revert to my defaults. For some of you out there, this is about saying, hey, you know what? We want to find our rhythm again. We got knocked off our sprints rhythm. We want to get back and we want to get into this work. So how could you get moving? Well, Renee, I'll ask you to drop in the link to our Teaching Sprint starters on the website, because one of the things I need you to know is that for the first few sprints, it doesn't really matter. It's mostly about building a new habit and way of working in the sprints process. And so in partnership with my co-author, Bronwyn Ryrie Jones, a terrific educator, instructional coach, and consultant in Victoria, we came up with a whole range of teaching sprints starters. And we were fortunate to have friends like Tom Sherrington, people like Dylan William, to do a series of short videos for us. And typically when we get started, I know some people are saying, oh, how much choice should we give teachers? And should we look, that's going to be a decision based on your own culture within your team or school. Some are absolutely fine with saying we've already got a school-wide focus in our school improvement plan. And so we pick that and people are all working within that focus. For others, you say, look, that wouldn't go down that well. We need to have more flexibility and autonomy. Fine, just in the first few rounds, it doesn't matter. The point is to get people moving and experiencing part of this work. So teaching sprint starters are a really good way to get moving. For us, this was about saying, hey, what are strategies that are effective? They really do pay off, that are feasible. Most humans can do them, and they're versatile. You can use them around a whole range of different areas you're working on. And so what you'll see here, you're going to start to see a whole range of simple starters. Tom Sherrington did some good videos here about things like using worked examples or model metacognitive talk or presenting materials in small steps. Bronwyn Ryrie Jones did some great ones around, the ones that I see people use most are probably these ones: checking responses of all students and picking non-volunteers. Such simple but powerful approaches that in the lesson observations I do are very inconsistent. And there's a lot of lost learning that would be much more effective if we all thought as educators about some of these simple and powerful techniques. Other elements about retrieval practice and spaced review. And then, of course, thinking together about formative assessment strategies from the guru himself, Dylan William. So one of the simplest ways to begin is just say, look, don't get caught up in reading detailed peer review articles of research. Don't get caught up in trying to sort of make this too complicated. Pick a starter, watch the video, talk about it, get moving. And you can be out the door and into a sprint in 40 minutes. It's energizing. People love it because they said, oh, it was a professional learning that was actually about practice. It didn't go on and on. I got some choice. And a day or two later, I was already getting some benefit from it. One of the things that I'm most grateful for is Tom Sherrington's work on walkthroughs. This came out about 4 or 5 years into teaching sprints and our work, or into the sprints journey. And I must say, it has saved us a huge amount of time. Walkthroughs times teaching sprints is probably the match made in heaven for simple professional learning. Tom and Oliver have done an incredible job of summarizing a lot of key strategies and techniques down at what I would call being the sand level. And so to give you an example, if you're interested in taking teaching sprints and then using some of the materials from something like walkthroughs, you'll see things like Tom would say, there's a nice little cluster of ideas, something like picking non-volunteers, cold calling, think, pair, share, and checking for understanding. And when we've actually often worked, and particularly in a secondary school context, this is often a very powerful thing to get working on, that people get started by saying, look, I want to get better and better at getting more students to be thinking when I ask a question. Now, most students work out pretty quickly. They stay still, don't make eye contact. The answer will come out in the room without them having to do anything. So picking non-volunteers really taps into this idea of enhancing people's motivation to engage and ensuring they're using their working memory to think about or to retrieve from long-term memory what the teachers asked about, and really helping them, as Daniel Willingham says, learning is a residue of thinking. Learning is a residue of thinking. If we want more people thinking, then using cold calling or picking non-volunteers is a really powerful one. Well, if you want to give people a sense of how to think a little bit before that request for them to share what they've been doing, often people go back to that classic of think, pair, share. But when we run this, and this is probably the most commonly used first sort of starter or first kickoff, particularly in primary schools that want to get everyone to do something similar, teachers often talk about how they used to think pair, share was really simple. They've heard about it for years, but they realize they often don't actually build in the individual think time. and that think, pair, share has turned into pair share. And they're getting a lot of lost, really deep thinking time from that individual. And then say it again better, which is just a way of building on, supporting and enhancing the quality of thinking going on. See, this is a really good, simple example of how you could get into the work without having to have a long background about, oh, well, what's the shared focus and how do we build buy-in for this? The buy-in often comes by getting into the work and focusing on things that everyone, no matter what level of expertise they have, could enhance their craft in. A third idea to get started, and this is in our research links, Renee, if you could put our Teaching Sprints research links, is to start off with Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction, a terrific paper that codifies thinking in cognitive science, expert teaching studies, and experimental studies. And I've really never found giving people Rosenshine's principles results in anything but people picking something and saying, yeah, you know what, this describes great teaching. And yes, there's parts here that I either want to further enhance my habits in or would like to return because I've never really added that to my repertoire. There's all sorts of ways to get started, whether it's Rosenshine's, whether it's walkthroughs, whether it's using our starters. The number one important thing here is to begin and to learn by doing rather than getting caught in this model of how am I going to get it to be perfect. A last little prompt, and these are all online, would be to really focus on teaching sprints and areas of space retrieval practice. These are all up online and free. And again, you know, one of the most important things we all acknowledge is the book Make It Stick says, a central challenge to improving the way we learn is finding a way to interrupt the process of forgetting. And if you find this a challenge with your students, if you're trying to build that core kind of knowledge and understanding that's going to be so crucial for them to do higher order transfer and deep kind of learning, then perhaps running some sprints in and around space retrieval practice might be something interesting for you. All right. Well, what I've tried to suggest today is that leaders of professional learning in teams, in schools, and in systems need to design in the reality that our teams are overloaded, exhausted, and stretched. But if in every term or in every year we say we're so flat out, we're going to have to just put practice improvement to the side, then bit by bit, we're going to hit a premature plateau of our expertise. And we're also going to miss out on the joy and the well-being uplift that happens from just making progress in our craft. So I think teaching sprints, which has been around for a long time, may well be exactly the type of process that you might want to explore in your context. It's not the right solution for all problems. And it definitely doesn't need to substitute or mean that you have to get rid of everything you've built and head off into some new direction. No, instead, sprints is really an approach that says, if you want to help overloaded educators get better, then what we should probably do is focus on instructional habits and make some progress together. We can do that by being realistic, focusing on tiny shifts, offering opportunities for research engagement, and ensuring that new learning gets applied in action through intentional practice. Ideas are useful, but processes give us a shared way of doing this work together and sustaining over time. And so taking the teaching sprints process, the prepare, sprint, review, and the sub-elements could mean that every educator has a clear view of what it would actually take to enhance their craft. When we see people do teaching sprints around the world, some people call it teaching sprints. They like the color green and they use all of the materials that are freely available. Others say, look, Simon, we've had some challenges before about anything that feels too outside in. So what we've done is that we've taken the teaching sprints process and get this, we call it something else. And they say, is that okay? We call it the development cycle or the expertise process. I say, that's great, good call. Anything you can do to make this something that will land in your context, that will feel as though it's the next logical step in your work and that it's come from inside rather than being sort of brought in from outside is going to be exactly the right set of calls to make to increase the likelihood of this working in your context. So you have permission, you have official license to adapt this process and to make it work for you. Alrighty. Well, today I've tried to give you a broad overview of the why, the what, the how, and the potential next steps. On our website, there are plenty of free resources for you to dig in. And over the next 24 hours, we're going to provide you the recording, the slides, and a range of other links that might help you get into the implementation exploration questions that many of you are already starting to think through. But remember, the most important thing to do, if you think there's value in this approach, is to get moving, to try it out in a small, simple way with a small group of volunteers, to share that experience with others, and then build the momentum from there. So I'm going to pause it now. I'm going to say thanks so much for being here. And we're going to move into a series of questions now. And so if you do have any questions, as I see Damien has one, please write question, and then we'll try to work through as many of those as possible. Thanks everyone for being here. I really appreciate you engaging. And the only rule with teaching sprints is when you make it better and when you adapt it to your context, could you let us know so we can share it with others in the community? Thanks all. Some of them. The ideal is that the school already has a school improvement plan and they've done some analysis of the problems they're trying to solve, and they've identified some key areas of practice that they're trying to work on. That would mean that there'd be really clear alignment between what the school is trying to do collectively and what teacher teams are working on individually. That'd be ideal, because then the teaching sprints and the work we're doing is adding up in that work. So for example, if the decision was made school-wide that we're going to be working on formative assessment and maybe building that on Dylan Williams' work embedding formative assessment, that's already there. And so within the teacher teams, we might give people choice around which strategies or techniques within the school approach to formative assessment that they're choosing to work on. But we wouldn't necessarily let them go off and choose some other interest area, because the point is collectively over the next 1 to 3 years, we're trying to learn how to apply Dylan's approach to formative assessment. And so choice within that set. So too, people do teaching sprints sometimes in reading instruction, mathematics instruction, writing, and that's already in their plan. They've already got some approaches. And so teaching sprints becomes the way to actually mobilize that evidence. At other times early on, you might have a broader instructional framework. Many schools and systems have an instructional framework. For example, in Victoria, they have something called the HITS, the high impact teaching strategies. But you might start with a process, an instructional set of ideas there from the system. And then you might say, hey, we're going to focus in on a school on a few of these over the next term or two. So wherever possible, it's great if the school has at least got what we call the same boulder level. We're working the same boulder. And then it's possible that teams have slightly different pebble or sand. That said, have you been to a book club? And if you have, been to a book club where everyone chose their own book? It sounds really good on the front end, right? Oh, think about the buy-in. Everyone will love this book club because they just get to choose their own book. Well, it sounds good on the front end, but then after a couple of weeks and you come back together, it's kind of a boring book club, because I talk about something that you're not engaged in, and then someone else, and we just take it in turns talking. But if we're working all on something similar, either a book of a similar genre, or even better, the same book, you know what? Sometimes it's more interesting to join a book club where even if I didn't choose the book, we're all talking about something similar. And so we typically see the most enjoyment come where people are working on very similar strategies, if not the same strategy. But Andrew, it's really going to depend on your context. If you're going to get a bit of pushback and that hasn't been the norm, give people a broad menu to choose from, something like our starters or Rosenshine's principles, or grab a copy of walkthroughs and say, hey, we're all going to work on, say, explaining and modeling or questioning. And then over 6 months to a year, you might move in a direction where you can get people a little bit more aligned around that. So hope that's useful. So learning sprints, the background to that was basically the idea of sprints at the core hasn't changed, but over time we've listened in to teachers and educators and how these things landed. So We used to call it, when it first was developed, improvement sprints. And we called it for improvement sprints for about a year. And then unfortunately, people said improvement sounded really negative. I was like, why? Like, we're trying to get better at something. They said, yeah, but it seems like it's a deficit model. So I said, okay. So they're teacher learning sprints. It's all about the teacher learning that has an impact on student learning. But learning sprints was a nice, pithy statement. And so we said learning sprints. It's about the teacher learning that has an impact on the student learning. And over about 2-3 years, what we actually found is that many educators who hadn't been involved directly with a member of our team were turning sprints into sort of a tier 2 intervention. The learning was only about the student learning, and they'd really lost the focus on their own practice improvement. And so in 2019, we made the hard decision. And I remember Bron said to me, hey, maybe we should just call it teaching sprints. And it really was, I think, a tough call, because we had hundreds of schools who were doing the process, calling it learning sprints. But we actually realized that the majority of schools and the majority of educators that were going to use this process hadn't yet heard of it. And so we made the hard iterative decision to say, when we use the term teaching sprints, every teacher said, oh, so it's about my teaching. Yeah. But when we use the word learning sprints, because teachers are so thoughtfully focused on student learning, when they hear the word learning, they always think of students. So as we've made that change, and when we actually put out the book and called it Teaching Sprints, we have found more educators get it first time, that it's about them, their craft and their expertise. Gemma, you mentioned about a hunch about your impact. Shouldn't that be verified? Yeah, I want to say that there's a very messy relationship over the short term between how you're teaching and the actual student learning outcome. It's a lot of difficulty in drawing any strong conclusions about what you've done now and what's happening in 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, that's number one. As Dylan Williams says, teaching happens at a time, learning happens over time. So in our process, we absolutely suggest people collect evidence of impact. That might be evidence of student behavior, evidence of student perceived engagement, what they're doing within their work samples. And for some areas you might work on, you might actually be able to see some sort of pre and post test movement. But people are working on a whole range of different areas. And so we have, I guess, a broad view of collecting impact evidence and making claims around that evidence about the extent to which you have a hunch that this is being effective. The reason why I'm saying is a hunch based on evidence is that we really want to move away from stressing teachers out. And we found this. We said, did the sprint work? And they got really stressed about somehow trying to prove the learner outcome moved over 3 to 4 weeks. And that can somehow also create some really maladaptive ways of thinking about improvement, as though the sprint was a failure if the student learning didn't move. Or even they felt very tense about doing the sprint because they say, oh, I haven't got baseline data about the students. And here's what's interesting. They ended up doing nothing because they were so stressed about some of that. So early on, just focus on getting teachers to understand the research, try it out. Then we start to, as we move on, try to dial up the evidence collection and evidence discussion. But my experience is if you go too hard on demanding evidence of impact and did it work, you can absolutely ruin the process. People are so stressed about it, they don't start it. Or they're so stressed about it, they only work on things that they know they can move. But we actually want people to go and work on things that they're still exploring and they're not sure. So hope that's useful. Agree with you, but just be very careful about trying to make people make definitive claims about learning improvement over 2 to 4 weeks. Most of the things we're talking about take quite a while for that to change the learning trajectory of those kids. Michelle, that's great. Nolene, others, and so appreciate your questions, your thought and engagement in this. Fantastic. All right. Colleagues, over to you. My job is to provide frameworks, tools that might be useful, to test them with real educators so I can have a strong degree of confidence that they are field tested and usable, and then to put them in hands of people like you and say, go and flourish, go and put them to work. And then could you let us know how it goes and how we can help? So thanks everyone. Great to have you here. I'm going to close off the session. And check out your inbox over the next 24 hours. We'll make sure we give you a range of resources and materials to get you moving in your context. Thanks, everyone.